Hello! Welcome to a new week of Bible study as we continue to delve deeply into the life of Joseph, son of Jacob. Now, the events of chapter 41 changed everything in the life of Joseph. He went from being an imprisoned slave to second in command of all of Egypt. Now, chapter 42 starts a brand new section. Joseph's brothers go down to Egypt. Yes, the same brothers who at first thought to kill him, and then, thinking better of it, sold him into slavery, as if that was much better. They go down to Egypt and meet Joseph. Now, this is going to begin a rather large section of the story, which involves all of Joseph's family eventually, due to the 7 years of famine. That's really the key to understand in chapter 42. This is during the 7 years of famine. So let's get into it. Chapter 42, verses 1 through 5. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt, so go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was a famine in the land of Canaan also. And this sets up the story telling us why they went to Egypt. The Zondervan Study Bible reminds us that this was a pretty significant event in the history of Israel. So significant, it's actually mentioned by Stephen in his speech just before he's martyred. That is found in the book of Acts. Now, this story begins to explain why Jacob and his family went to Egypt. And one of those reasons, well, the big one, was the 7-year famine. But keep it in mind, it's significant historically for the people of Israel. Now, it's interesting what John MacArthur said in these first few verses. Here's his commentary and what it says. Jacob's sons were traumatized in the famine, and Jacob was reluctant to let his family return to Egypt, not knowing what would happen to them. With no choices left, he dispatches them to buy grain in Egypt. Wait, his sons were traumatized? How? Well, let's be honest. There's a severe famine going on in the world that was deeply affecting life in Canaan and the entire known world. So there was nowhere else for them to go to get the food they needed. But of all places that they had to go, Egypt? Did you notice the comment or actually question that Jacob asked here? Because it's very interesting. He says this to the brothers, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" Strange question, isn't it? Well, the fact of the matter is there may have been some reluctance. They had some emotional baggage when it comes to Joseph. They sold him to the Ishmaelites headed to Egypt, and in order to get food, well, they were going to need to go to the same place. MacArthur focuses on Jacob's part of it. He was hesitant to send his sons into Egypt because he'd already lost one, and he was in no condition to lose any of the others. In the end, there was one thing that they had to do, and that was they were out of options. He had to send his sons down to Egypt, but he was unwilling to send one of them. It wasn't a short journey. It certainly had its dangers, but Jacob wasn't going to let Benjamin go. The youngest. Benjamin was the youngest. He didn't want him to be a casualty. And the reason is because he was the remaining son to his beloved wife, Rachel. Now, some commentators like MacArthur suggest that Benjamin was his favorite. Now, we're going to read some things later where I'm not so sure that's true. But one thing is for certain, and that is that he was protecting the only child left from Rachel. Actually, remember now, she'd been gone longer than Joseph. Israel's son, without Benjamin, went to buy grain. Now, Linda B. Hinton tells us that when you look at Egyptian documents and artwork, it shows that people came to buy food from Egypt during famines throughout history. And not only is this not unusual, it's not the first time. because Jacob's grandfather, now remember, Jacob's name was also Israel, Israel's grandfather, Abraham had to do the same thing as well. Now, let's go on, because what we want to look at now is Joseph's perspective in this. Joseph's part of the story, and that is found in chapter 42, verses 6 through 12. Now, Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their face to the ground. Does that sound familiar? As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Harshly. We got to consider that. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Isn't that interesting? They did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. No. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." Now, I hate to stop there, but I have to, because there's quite a bit in this story that we need to look over. Now, the important part's really going to come tomorrow, and I want to kind of set that up today. But there's a lot of stuff here that we really need to think about. I love what Linda Hinton writes. Here's what she says. In this chapter, the storyteller begins to reveal another side of Joseph. He is now a powerful man, not a helpless boy or a slave as in the past. In his new identity and his new position of authority, he is suddenly confronted with his brothers and with his past. No doubt, Joseph has strong conflicting feelings about this, including both joy and anger. Now, you may be surprised by my biggest criticism on what she writes. No, Joseph, in my opinion, at this point, doesn't have a new identity or a new position. His rebirth, his reshaping, has been over time. He's been in this position for well over 7 years at this point. So remember, there's 7 good years, right? Then comes the famine. Now, I think it took some time within this famine for the brothers to be sent down. Remember how hesitant Jacob was? So you're probably talking maybe 8 years in, maybe not that long, but quite a bit of time has passed. Joseph is not even close to that 17-year-old boy from Canaan. And I think that's one of the reasons that Joseph's brothers don't recognize him. MacArthur has some other reasons I think are very interesting. Remember, Jacob has become Egyptian in his appearance and his dress. His beard was shaved. He wore different clothes. And at this point, he's second in command. So he is very, very different than he was before, inside and out. Next, he treats them without a hint of familiarity here. He's playing a part. And he's playing it well. What you and I need to think about is, why is he playing that part? Why does Joseph do the things he does? Why does he treat them in the way he does? See, that's what Hinton is trying to get at. That's why she senses joy and anger in his response. Now, the biggest criticism that modern commentators like Hinton receive from traditional commentators like MacArthur is the idea of Joseph feeling anger. Is that being fair? Well, quite frankly, it is a harsh word, I'll admit that, but it's hard for me to disagree. I'll admit we need to consider that Joseph does soften over his time later. I mean, he softens his stance. He even weeps, in this chapter for them. But Hinton acknowledges that in her commentary. I think she's spot on. Let's dig deep and let's take a look at it step by step. And I think you'll realize that Joseph's going through a lot of emotional things here. The first thing that he goes through, remember, he is the governor at this point, right? Second in command. So they bow down before him, and that's obviously is going to stir up a lot of emotion. So the first thing he decides to do is to pretend to be a stranger. Now, why do you think he does that? He asks them where they come from. He knows that answer. But he doesn't know how honest they're going to be. He doesn't know if they're going to be straightforward and tell the truth. He needs to know what kind of people they are now. Many years have passed. Who are his brothers now? So once he remembers his dreams and realizes the dream was being fulfilled, he says to them, very cleverly too, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." Now, Hinton does a brilliant job of explaining this. This is not a far-fetched accusation without merit. Joseph really is very, very intelligent. He always seems to be a step ahead. Through the centuries, Egypt faced many invasions from the east. So this charge is not outlandish. And we'll consider tomorrow why he may have made the accusation, but for now, he's being really smart. Egypt had much grain during a famine, and they were vulnerable to an attack from nations who wanted what Egypt had. Joseph wanted to see how his brothers would react to this claim. And it's very interesting what they do. They make a claim Joseph certainly could deny. They called themselves son of one man, honest men. Honest men? Now, MacArthur is straightforward on this one. He certainly thinks there's been some things that happened in the past where honest men wasn't being very honest with them. So here they are in front of this governor who controls the food supplies, and they say they're honest men just looking for food. The fact of the matter is, Joseph uses that later to accomplish something very near and dear to his heart. But in the meantime, I want you to think about this reading. Is Joseph being fair? Is Joseph being mean here? Is this a bit of a payback? What do you think? Because we're going to see something Joseph does tomorrow that really requires a lot of thought. So I want you ready for that. Do you agree with Linton Hinton that this was an emotional moment where Joseph expressed some issues that he's had for a long time with his brother? Or was he simply trying to get to know them a lot better and who they were, who they truly were now? Love to know what you think. In the meantime, we'll continue to study tomorrow. Now, we've got a lot of things going on in the world that I want to address. I understand that for some of you, this is a very difficult time. It's a difficult time for me too. But I think this is one of those times where we need to be like Joseph in our difficulty. We got to trust in God. We need to rely on God. We can't understand everything that's happening. But it is through God that we can find peace. Even in uncertain times like this, God can help us be at peace. And that's what we need to do. You and I need to trust in God through everything. Until next time, until tomorrow, God bless you.